Hello everyone, today I would like to come back on the topic of chivalry, as I've been starting to talk about this recently. I even decided to dedicate a new series of videos about this topic. They won't be framed into a specific playlist. They will probably have to do mostly with either medieval warfare or medieval society playlist, as I think that, as I said also in the other videos, this is a crucial topic, not just of medieval history, and today we will kind of give a look a bit to not really the misconceptions only, but just also thinking and especially thinking about the different perspectives we have on the Middle Ages. But for the whole history of the world, as this is really something I can't stress really enough, how the figure of the knight, of the ideals of chivalry are something you might even argue meta-historical. And I'm not making here a a metaphysical point or anything like that. I'm just stressing the fact that the Middle Ages, as we have created them historically, is obviously never existed. It is obviously something we have created for some reasons that mostly have to do with our reaction to, I think, in great part, to chivalric culture broadly meant. Both in positive and in negative terms, and that we still have to understand instead in its broader meaning, in the fact that chivalry is something that was born even in the Indo-European prehistory, ever since horses were domesticated and at the point of being able to ride them into battle, which is something I've actually never discussed. I mean, looking at the prehistory of how it happened, prehistory at least, compared to other areas of the world that were already into history proper, as we can trace written documents from them. So, as you understand, this is an extremely wide, deep topic, and today's video is really gonna be more than an introduction. I would say a general reflection of mine on how I will be doing this, and what I think of chivalry, as how we should consider that, or at least, I maybe I sound too arrogant. I mean, it's not that we should consider it for some reason, but pointing out sometimes the mistakes that you can definitely figure out when studying history and realizing what chivalry, at least for what we can historically reconstruct, really was. And you know that there is an endless bibliography on the topic, quite international one, because basically every kind of I'm not aware about in the Eastern world. I know that there are definitely very important chivalric cultures all over, feudal cultures all over the world, and indeed, I'm just, however, saying I'm wondering how the local national historiographies responded to that, which I'm sure surely did it in positive terms. But when you think about, I don't know, the same European chivalry, you have really to imagine that something that is really broadly meant in a sort of Indo-European way. I find really shameful, and I cannot find a better term for this, how chivalry has been reduced in pop culture as the extremely narrow, mostly 15th century Western European thing, in terms of even of just a fashionable. Yeah, I know this is an approximation, but naturally, just even cross away the 15th century. I just increase. I wanted to stress the 15th century because we have a mostly Gothic, pre-Raphaelite picture of the Middle Ages was built up during the 19th century. It was mostly British based and looked at that particular period that I don't know is the one in the War of the Roses, just to make it an example. So you see this armor, this almost invariably stereotypical full plate armor that somehow has to identify chivalry and the Middle Ages and knighthood, but as you understand, this was extremely more varied, and telling the truth, this really changes according to the national perspective, because surely the French, the Germans, the Spanish, the Italians have all very different views of chivalry, in spite of the common ground, obviously, because that's what I want to stress. And this is particularly interesting. I've never discussed this on Schwerpunkt, because in the essentials, feudal culture was practically the same all over Western Europe, but there were significant political and social differences, as every knight was kind of a different thing. I mean, French knights were very different things from German knights, and a very different thing from Italian knights, and in spite of the common, even the same functions practically, because the European miles, especially by the 12th century, but even before, you can trace that to the world migration era, since late Roman times, essentially was identical. If you take from Portugal to Poland, from Denmark to Sicily, the European knight is essentially the same exact thing. There are people who like even to stress the degree of, who was kind of the better trained, who had the better military quality and all. I'm sure you can trace something like that at a structural level if you really study the sources, and I'm pretty much involved into this as well at this time of my life. But tendentially, I have a generally, I don't like to draw these differences, because my interpretation of the whole thing is that, one country could have been more functional to a certain type of cavalry. If you think about the northern French cavalry that was considered by every single European people, and also by other peoples, the flower of chivalry, and if you want to explain this, you have to understand what was northern French feudalism compared to other areas of Europe, and you realize in the northern French aristocracy was essentially the wealthiest one. For instance, it was the one that had more resources to invest into war, into equipment and all. But even in here, so this really made the difference mostly probably at the collective level, in the sense that perhaps northern French cavalry was the best just because it had this more resources could be invested in directing the war, and collecting big armies of knights. But there was no essential difference, for instance, at an individual level, I believe. I mean, if you take, I don't know, the German knights of the forests, still of the, I don't know, of the first half of the 12th century, or if you take a Siculo-Norman knight, or if you take a Spanish jinete of the Reconquista, or if you take, I don't know, even if you go far east, where feudalism had not, Frankish feudalism had not really spread, what you see is that also in there the essentials were pretty much the same. In a clientary aristocratic society, if you take the Slavic Druzinas, for instance, or if you go even, if we're not talking about other eminently feudal and lands of much older feudalization compared to Europe, just like Persia, you realize that it was essentially the same thing. When the Crusaders invaded the Near East, they met not really for the first time, because there were Western mercenaries into the Near and the Middle East already, arguably since ever, during high medieval times, and even the migration era. Indeed, I like to stress this continuity. However, even when these crusaders met with the Seljuk Turks, they were heavily Persified or Persianized. I don't know how to say that. You realize that there was a kind of a mutual respect, aside from the ferocity and the hatred and the violence and the cruelties, that was recognized in a mutual respect that was recognized because of this sort of chivalric common ground that existed. Really, it was at the base of all the Eurasian of all those peoples that, one way or another, had been influenced and had derived from the Eurasian steppes. So, including the talking about the Indo-Europeans broadly meant, but chivalry is something you find also in much wider. The Eurasian steppes, first of all, are very wide. They arrived up to China, up to the Bering Strait. If you take Tibetan society, that was a typically feudal, very heavily feudal society. Medieval Japan definitely had a feudal society, and all these societies produced knights. So, and if you look at the degrees of professionalism that also the fighting styles, etc., aside from the minor differences, you can always spot certain constants into this, and really understanding how a feudal society is necessarily going to produce a chivalric culture, broadly meant. Excuse me, I drink a little. So this is why I like to stress the spatial and temporal dimensionality of chivalry, because that's something that really is lost in the mists of prehistory. Especially if you take the Indo-Europeans that brought with them in Europe the after their migrations, all their myths or their legions that had to do with chiefly cavalry. And you see how the Europeans during ancient times, medieval times, still were kind of, doesn't matter if they were Christianized, but they were perfectly still feeling those ancient traditions. I mean, even the Christian knighthood is something that draws heavily from this pagan past, and you can argue that these relics of paganism in symbolism and have always remained kind of essential to the figure of the knight. Naturally, Christianity has done this huge and incredible work of, let's say, of adaptation of the culture of the pagan world, and this could have not really been done differently, because certain roots were so strong that you couldn't do anything but integrate them partly into Christian symbolism and on. I haven't really been discussing this much on Schwerpunkt, albeit I've been, I have at this point a pretty hefty playlist of on medieval Christianity that takes into consideration mostly ecclesiastical and ecclesiological problems. So not talking excessively about this relation with paganism, but I often hinted at that, and I really deem it to be an extremely fascinating topic to deepen in the future. Devoid of any ideology. Another thing I'm very saddened by is seeing how seemingly the modern world still has a great handicap in discussing such topics without being ideological or ideologicized in some fashion. Out there, all I see is people who have to reason either in a when discussing history, either in a theistic or in an atheistic way. And this has nothing to do with your beliefs, because I think that both being a believer or being an atheist is perfectly fine. I don't care. I think everybody is entitled to really believe anything, and that's probably the most important thing of all. To make a stand autonomously, to take a stand autonomously, independently, to really believe in what you feel, because this is really what I've. Although I'm not a moral relativist, but what I mean is that when you discuss history, you can't really take ideological stance. I mean, you can still believe. I mean, you can definitely be, I don't know, a theist and an atheist and study history objectively. I have a great faith in this. I mean, why not? Human mind can do that. It's not a problem. We can definitely achieve that. But the problem is when you realize that at a massive structural level, a society like ours that has to be allegedly at this point the most advanced intellectually of all history is still not capable of making this extremely simple step. That is to say, okay, I will study history for what it is from the sources, and not because I want to tell my version of how I hope history has gone, because I have to back my beliefs. Because this is an insult to the dignity of human civilization. And as long as I will have voice, I will speak up against these ways of using history, because even if you want to do that, because you're free to do that, if you want to invent your history on your own, you're free to do that. Nobody will probably stop you. Of course, you're probably gonna meet resistance to that, because if a person presents you with evidence that things went otherwise, it's gonna be a problem for you if, I don't know, you're gonna make a historical point. But the problem to me, really, and I realize this is quite personal, but you can't think logically, you probably think otherwise, is that I have a huge admiration and respect for the people who preceded us. And I'm not making it a point of, trying to looking at our ancestors as better or worse people than we are. Sometimes in my videos I say things like, never think to be more intelligent or more capable than a person who lived 2,000 years ago. And this is what I also firmly believe as a historian, because of the very meaning of that. But this is also perhaps a bit ideological myself, so I'm a bit hypocritical now. But the point is, just imagine, I don't know, in 2,000 years from now, and to have people that at this point might be your descendants or something like that, but they're so very far from you. They have a completely different moral, completely different ethic, and they reason. I mean, who knows? Maybe in 2,000 years the world, human civilization would not exist. But let's assume that will be. And just how it would make you feel to know that people in 2,000 years from now will misunderstand what your life has been. So in history this always happens, because history is not truth. History is never true. History is just an approximate attempt to reconstruct reality with an extremely scanty evidence most of the time. Mm. But one thing is, meeting these difficulties, objective difficulties of lack of knowledge, and because we don't have the sources. One thing is, wanting to read history in your own way, just because you feel like that. Mm. And I realize we all do. I do it myself. Everybody does that by a certain extent. But I think there is a limit of decency for which, when you pretend to know history without even having reflected about it, and really just stating whatever you want, because from your narrow-minded 21st century perspective, you back that political side or that other, or that belief or that or other, you're doing nothing but to insult the memory of the people who came before you, and most likely to insult the memory of the people who made possible for you to just exist. That is something you should never forget. But even living in the world that you live, because what we have now is something we have never had in history. We have never been so long living like now. We're never been so better living in quality right now. I know there is some debate about this, because there are lots of people who believe that, especially the so-called survivalist people, who believe that hunter-gatherers were actually living better than we are doing now. Well, I don't know. I don't want to respond to this, because I admit I should have a more thorough look into the thing, because the answer is not that simple as you can imagine. But just saying, oh well, now just think we have a home, a shelter, we can eat and all. That perspective goes a bit beyond that. It's simply saying that in spite of that, it was still, hunter-gatherers were still living a better existence than our own, and this is, so there are different perspectives, but this just now I'm digressing. But just for saying that everything you have now, you owe it to people who came before of you. And you can argue that the only reason why we study history is actually because we are curious about those people, and because we want to figure out, in fact, what they were. Like, history is definitely also very useful for many other things, because it tells us so much about our current human society. That is not just history. You can argue with every discipline, not even just the strictly humanistic ones like anthropology, or those that are meant really to look at humanity in a broader, in a specific way. Even if you study astrophysics, you get a better understanding of human society. It's not purely, it's not pure calculation. Even something so abstract like mathematics is telling, however, how the world works, and without mathematics we couldn't do anything in our lives. So it still tells us so much, even if it doesn't, if it deals just with numbers, and not with people, because incidentally it was people who invented numbers just to figure out how the world is. So you realize it's like a circle. And it all makes sense, all in a human perspective. This is also, what you can philosophically argue to be the deal of our existence. We don't know absolutely why we are here, and all our explanations start from our own perspective, and we're kind of caged into this, and I believe it's a beautiful cage, because it's definitely very interesting and fascinating. But we also have to be honest about how it works. So looking at history, is profitable, in my opinion, as long as you remain neutral while you are a historian. Then, when you close the book, you're not a historian anymore. You are, I don't know, you are a citizen. You're an individual. You have your own opinions, your subjective, perspective, your judgments, etc. But history is supposed to be, at least methodologically, a science. So you can't really say, yeah, it's not an exact science. It doesn't look anything like that. But at the same time, there is a sort of ethics related to that is something that goes beyond the job of the historian, but it should be part of the job of the human. As humans, we are all historians, as if we, if anything, for a cognitive reason, because we interact with the world throughout our senses. So our senses are giving us certain informations that we have to interpret to figure out how the world around us is. So you are a historian even before you came out of your mother's womb, indeed, because you sense what happens all around already at that point. So it's so deep as a history should be increasingly felt as this utmost ethical duty, more than, because for many people I realize that history is a sort of divertissement, right? It's like, let's have fun, let's look at this picture that looks cool, and let's think this was true in the past, and start fantasizing about it, and that's where these misconceptions actually come out. And about chivalry, we have in the Middle Ages, broadly meant, we definitely have, I think, some of the greatest problems as a society to still look at it in real. So, as I was saying before, at least in the West, also, as you realized before, it was also kind of tearing apart the concept of West as in this interpretation, because there are many ways you can interpret the West. For instance, it's an approximation, but I still use it. I feel myself to be a Westerner, for instance. But when I try to figure out what is that it makes me a Westerner, say, is it my language? Is what I look like? Is it what I don't know, how I think? This is also another extremely big chapter that we can't touch now, because it would be kind of silly to even pretend to do it. But let's put it in this way. My favorite approximation in this sense is to conceive our Western identity in this originally Indo-European character, which is also an approximation. Because as Westerners, our ancestors were, Indo-Europeans, were the Aryans, but at the same time they were peoples that lived in Europe and in other areas that weren't, and they already lived in there. However, what is important in this is by how influent even a relatively now I don't want to go too much in detail, but let's say that however Indo-European society was able Indo-European culture was able to take over in parts in all the areas where it went. This happened also in other times, and because it happened at various waves. The first Indo-European waves were in the from the end of the second millennium BC into Europe, but you can argue that even the migration era was a moment of, wave of injection of this steppes culture into Europe once again. This is something I stressed really. I like to stress very much. Also, to really, if you really want to use the term Middle Ages, that naturally it's kind of stupid and as an approximation, but you can maybe that's an important part. The Middle Ages has been kind of marked by this phase of new blending in of the Indo-European peoples during the migration, but it's not all that. And it's not all that also relatively to chivalry, and we will see it maybe at another time, because well, maybe it's better not to talk. Excuse me, I drink a little bit. But nevertheless, it's remarkable that maybe we can approach it anyway. That these chivalric ideals were at a point undetached from a really let's say a horse riding society. That's what I wanted to stress. If you look at the mythology of of the Germans, of the Celts, of the Italics, or of the Greeks, and of other Indo-European populations, you'll see that despite these peoples were not horse-riding peoples anymore, because they weren't, just maybe the Thracians of the Danube were still kind of living in a similar fashion to the Scythians, etc. But let's say for talking about this narrow Western perspective, you see it, their mythologies are all about the steppes, deities of war, the horses, the dichotomy of heavens and earth. And this is naturally something that existed in all societies. So now I don't want to make it a prerogative of the Indo-Europeans, but indeed, there is all a branch of studies of history of religions, of anthropology, etc., that obviously tells us that there were arguably the same words that were used both in India and in ancient Rome, because those were coming from the same stock of the Caucasian steppes, and that's pretty much obvious, and you can see it everywhere. So another very stupid thing that is done, I believe, in modernistic ways, is to kind of oppose like the Roman Empire to the Romans to the Celts or the Germans. If you're doing that, you're still buying into the Roman propaganda that wanted to stress that the Romans were somehow different and civilized, and this is something that not even the Romans were really expressing in the way we interpreted it eventually during the Enlightenment, when we were obsessed by creating a sort of statal national world, because the Roman world was not secular at all. It was not modern at all. It was something extremely different. We should learn to understand, also under the light of Indo-European culture as a whole. For instance, Latin is renowningly almost extremely similar to Celt as a language. How many people do know this today? They like to stress, everything, that even the fact that, the Romans or the Celts looked differently, they spoke differently, were kind of conceived in positive terms. And why? Well, because someone in the 19th century was inventing this kind of sharp, prototypical and crypto-racist, well, not openly racist divisions, for which, different peoples have different stages of evolution, meant in a positivistic way. I believe in evolution, biologically speaking, of course, but if you look at what Darwin's theories were distorted, and immediately think about Spencer, taken from this ferociously racist, supremacist belief, for which that there are societies that are inferior to others because they are less developed, and that is all one with their race, this is not, fortunately, obviously, a way we interpret history anymore. I must say sadly that certain, you know, perceptions that were attached to this are still pretty much alive in our world, and even if they don't necessarily break out as openly racist things, however, this or deal with strictly racial issues, they, however, can let us mislead us even in interpretation of other things, like understanding in fact here what were the Romans, what was the Roman society, was what was the tribal society, and this is a mistake we do all the time, and this is something we, the concept of Western that we are applying today is something substantially created in I mean, that definitely came to its full development much late, arguably in the contemporary age, but that was being rooted especially in the modern age. Especially the narrow concept of Western world is something that was created because of the wars against the Ottoman Empire. Before those, the Europeans weren't really stressing this concept. I mean, and that's why one of the reasons for which we fail to recognize, for instance, how Western the Ottoman Empire practically was, even though obviously it was not. It was something extremely different, but we need to stereotypically say, to bring everything at an extreme, while reality is an intersection of things. Okay. So, but this led to very weird things. For instance, today we consider Western a country like Japan, but sometimes not a country like Brazil. Have you ever thought? But it's kind of weird. I mean, it's how you look at the world, to use a fixed system, and there are so many. I'm actually. I don't want to stress the. I'm European, and I like much before than Western, probably the concept of European. I mean, European to me has a mostly ethnical character, and I know I'm not an extreme fan of that too, but it kind of fits maybe more. When I'm thinking about being a Westerner, I think something different, like mostly kind of a of a way of thinking that I realize is being created during the modern age. I can't. There were roots also before, even in the same Middle Ages, and I'm also in here. I'm not a fan of the concept of modern. Not even when talking about the modern age. The modern age never existed, just like the Middle Ages never existed. But this narrow idea of Western Europe, it should kind of be torn apart if you want to approach the concept of chivalry, indeed, because it doesn't hold. Yes, I know Western feudalism is acceptable, I guess, because it was the Frankish feudalism in practice, so you can argue that, there was a kind of a geographical dimension to that exported feudalism all over Western Europe, mostly, as definitely if you take, I don't know, Russia, they weren't touched by, if not, in a very indirect way by that. Carolingian Europe really changed a lot in the way I will always talk about this on Schwerpunkt if you're interested. There's a Carolingian Europe playlist I've made. But wanting to stick to this abused Western perspective, let's say, and it's also a matter of sources, take this into consideration, that it's obvious, and that's why sometimes we're so Western-centric, because our you can see this even into Europe today. How much do you know, and how much have you read, on average, as a Westerner coming from everywhere, like even from New Zealand, from Canada, or about Western European history and Eastern European history? Because I realized that Eastern Europe is very close to me, and yet I don't. It's as if it was very distant instead. And I realized that all happens because my mind has been educated in a certain way because of these reasons. And there are reasons that are not justification, but definitely are, motivate how this happened. Because obviously Western Europe produced much more sources than Eastern Europe. Albeit this starts happening, yeah, obviously Western Europe was more Romanized, there were different premises, but also in here sometimes um, we we also tend to kind of diminish the importance of certain places because they were not documented. It's a bit, even at a temporal level, it's when we talk about the early medieval times and we use this insulting term of Dark Ages. Why? Do you think that that was a dark world that, that today we don't live in anymore, or that in other parts of the Middle? If there is just one thing that was dark about it, is that we didn't have sources, enough sources at least. Also in here it really depends on which place you are, because one thing is, there are various regions of Europe that left us different quantities of sources. It's obvious that Southern Europe was much better documented than Northern Europe, for instance. But why the early Middle Ages are so neglected even now, and they are considered as a dark hole with nothing interesting happening. People completely ignore that, and they're so obsessed instead in lower and later medieval times, because of historiographical interests, of lots of perspective, of national reasons. There are countries that definitely this happened all the time. If there was a particular moment of glory of one's country, and arguably almost at least all European countries had their moment of greatest achievement in history. If you take all the great empires that have and kingdoms have existed, so it's obvious that from that a single national perspective, there is much more attention, first of all, to a certain topic rather to another, but at the same time also a different relation with other parts in time. So even the differences between the Europeans are pretty strong, and the concept of knighthood is also very varied. At the same time, though, and this is particularly interesting because it's something I feel much as a medievalist, you can see that in the concept of chivalry in this sense offers a lot of common ground instead between all these various cultures. As I was saying before, then the medieval knight is just essentially one, conceptually. So if you take the French chevalier, cavalier, or the German Ritter, Reiter, or you take the caballero, the jinete in Spain, or the cavaliere in Italian, you see the trees where there are different names, so there is definitely a different semantics and different semantic involved, but it's the same time the same thing, or it declined in slightly different ways after all, as the substance was practically the same. Well, obviously the English knight as well, but since I was talking in English now, I didn't tell that. But there are many other names, and think also about how this concept of knighthood was was exported also linguistically speaking. For instance, I remember this because I've done those videos on the Polish medieval. It wasn't about chivalry, but it was about Polish tactics, Middle Ages, and I remember also from my master thesis in Polish, all these. For instance, it was a huge, a massive influence of German vocabulary that was feudal at that point. So that, for instance, I think in Polish the name for knight is rycer or something like that. It's obviously extremely similar to writer. To Ritter. So and also in here same kind of etymological roots as well, as Ritter would be rider essentially also in English, so there are common grounds. The French, the Italians, and the Spanish, the Romance language also, they have this different etymology, but however, the substance in many ways, as I already said, was the same. And this is really the point, that at an archetypical level, the figure of the knight is essentially impossible to equivocate. When I don't know if you ever thought about it, but when you say knight, the word knight, you're not really questioning what it is. There are many things that are much more difficult to objectivize. There are many names, even many. For instance, what is a legionnaire? It's much more difficult, at least for me, although I know what a legionnaire is also throughout all the various changes in Roman history, but the legionnaire is arguably something more difficult to define than a knight, although the knight in this sense lasted even more and was much more differentiated than a legionnaire, arguably, in because it was something that was so much more extended and much more common, and we have seen it to many more societies, whereas the legionnaire is just as long as you have a legion, essentially. So it's something narrower in section to of the society and etc. So what are the characteristics of a knight? Well, for me, I think the most important aspect of this, that is probably, I don't know, modern people, no, I don't want to say, but probably for many people it's the fact of having an armor or a sword. To me, really the thing that identifies the knight in my mind, so I'm making it now, we are here in the range of subjectivity, it's his war horse. I think you cannot understand something called chivalry, in fact, from caballos, that if you don't really understand this extremely ancestral relation, dating back to those Caucasian steppes millennia before Christ, between the rider and his horse. And it's a much I will probably dedicate a video about this relation as well, because it's something that has really such a deep meaning, and it's something that exists also for eminently practical reasons, because a war horse is going to do things that another horse will not do, and this means that it's the animal you have to ride into battle. So in a moment into which you're arguably, you can, it's kind of the ultimate the ultimate goal of anyone, of every true knight, to fight, because that's what they exist for. And you can't really go to war if you do not trust your horse, and the horse doesn't trust you. Because always remember that you can be an excellent knight and having a bad horse, that will never make you, or being a bad knight but having an excellent horse, but you will never do anything with that. In order to be a knight, you have to be an excellent fighter, and to have an excellent horse, and to have a relation of trust, of confidence with your animal, because that's what it has towards you. And you can't work into battle if you don't have this together. So that's probably, to me, the most important thing. The other ideal, this is very ideal probably of the knight, is his invincibility. We all know that the crude reality is these medieval knights had a very intense and very often very short life. Not just for fighting, because as you know, the first cause of death in war at the time was not being killed, but illness. And this has remained up to the 20th century. So the idea of the invincibility of the knight is kind of it's being produced sometimes to probably to exorcise the fear of death. The knight is not a symbol just like all the others. First of all, the knight is obviously doing some of the most dangerous things you can imagine in absolute terms. But he knows, first of all, how to do them, and secondly, it's his duty to kind of live through that. So it's as if it's also a matter of luck. Exercising is all about this. It's the idea that I know that I will probably die. I know that I will, sooner or later I will be killed. But nevertheless, I go, and that's really what it makes you invincible, because it's really being guided by a superior force that has nothing to do with man, because man instinctively want to live, and they tend to preserve their own life. So war in this sense is something very, very different, as it's the rationalization of doing something that is gonna probably take your life away, and yet there are valid reasons for doing it anyway. It kind of gets on my nerves when you find those culturalists who still believe, quite childishly I would say, that war is something primitive, that only barbarians do war, that reason makes people not fighting. Well, this is absolutely false. If there is a lesson that we have learned through history, is that war is not something that gets eliminated with the progress of human society. War is an ineliminable option from the instruments of politics, and it is a matter of ethics, because nobody wants to fight. Nobody wants to die, but there are certain moments in which this has necessarily to be done, because it's the only way to prevent other things to happen. And it's pretty obvious that in history everybody used the military instrument as the military mean as naturally also an instrument of oppression, of something that really hadn't to do with this noble defensive ideals, etc. But this is being used by everyone, and it's kept being used by anyone, because you can't eliminate that. There are conditions that can make wars coming less frequent. Indeed, just like now we live in one of the most peaceful times in history ever, just because we have nuclear weapons, and we perfectly know that using them wouldn't be, you know, convenient. But it's not that this makes us renounce the military and its use, and you see this all around. There are wars that are constantly being fought. They might not have a huge echo in the media, but they're there, and they're pretty intense clashes. And they all happen for the same reasons, that you don't have in this sense to judge. This is another thing that happens very much. You can't judge them morally in the sense that there is always someone who has the responsibility for these actions, but at the same time, the whole thing is very hybrid. I mean, there is not the pure good and the pure evil. There's always, of course, there is a balance for which there is someone who more or less is right and another that is more or less wrong. But already, even just understanding how it is, I personally have very strong opinions relative to this, and I won't tell you from which side I lean. But I realized that I need a freaking lot of information to get an accurate depiction of why a war is fought. Well, the invincibility is a sort of schematic thing. But it's still something that you need to feel to trust your military, to trust. And the knight, in this sense, is the symbol of a world society. I made a video that I particularly liked myself because most of all, excuse me. Most of the times I don't like the videos, how I make them. There is one that I like very much, the one about the French. The title is Odo of Cluny, Gerard of Aurillac, and Secular Holiness. Now that's a beautiful video because it touches exactly this point. How in post-Carolingian times, when the figure, especially of the knight, how we imagine it mostly in this kind of high medieval times at its height, at its acme, between the 10th and 13th century, was born, and how that figure was used essentially to comfort the population and adding a sacral. Even a sacral nature to it that arguably it already had, but this time was reinforced, especially in a Christian direction, and that was felt indeed as a guardian also of order. And you have to think of these knights in the High Middle Ages that were sometimes extremely terrible, sometimes were nothing more than brigands or pillagers and rapers, etc. But at the same time, there was also a widespread class of knights that were also in this sense very fragmented, and albeit controlling, being violent, being unruly, etc., they still participated to the progressive civil development during the Middle Ages, because they were lords of certain lands, they administrated it, they had. And if you were a peasant who broke his back all the day on the land and suffering and just being barely able to survive through that together with your family, you would probably be always trying, we don't have to be quite romantic about the Middle Ages. But even if that peasant probably felt the weight of that and knew perfectly how it happened with those noblemen that were essentially telling him what to do, I think that it would be indescribable to feel the emotions that this man could have when he saw those knights passing close to his land in that shiny armor and with those swords, with that on those horses. It was a symbol of greatness, wherever you wanted to call that. There are also many figures in history that are extremely controversial were not purely evil, that however you cannot help but recognize that of whom you cannot help to recognize their greatness. And this happens mostly the more the back you go in time. There have been great historical characters that especially commanders and that today we admire because they're kind of important in the past, right? So, but we feel a bit untouched, and that if they had been living today, we would feel them as kind of monsters, as in part were also perceived in that past. But still, we need to kind of surround them in a kind of aura of glory, of might, etc., because we somehow still need that exact same feeling that peasant in the 11th century felt when looking at those knights and saying, okay, they might be kind of what they are, but hey, these are placed in here by someone else, by something superior. And the proof was their might. The proof was their status, whichever it was. And that's why, in fact, we have built also a positive picture of the knight. The idea that the knight was had to be inherently good, right? I've met a lot of people. I mean, not met, and probably there were not even a lot, but there were enough at least to disturb me a bit. I wanted to say that knights back in the day were good. They were all good, because that was such a pure moment of society, and obviously these people were pretty inclined, also in their ideologically speaking, but they were essentially refusing the idea that these knights were thugs that did what they did, definitely. These were mobsters. Let's be honest about that. That's clienteling society are all mobster-like. You can't really differentiate things like a feudal corvée from protection money, essentially, because that's how the seigneurial system was practically born, and not just in the West, actually. It was all like that at the time. But we still think the knight is good, right? All the chivalric literature it's all about this. The knight is inherently good, or at least should be inherently good. It has to be the knight has to be a kind of a also of gentle soul. He has to be sweet and sensitive in some way. Now, this is very difficult, but although it has many many interesting psychological implications that do not have to be misunderstood. You have to think these just what a Midas of the 11th century could really be like. These people today would all be considered as mentally disturbed people. There is no way out of that. If you realize what life they had since childhood, and how they grew into manhood in the way they did, and how they were trained, how they were framed, how they were abused, how they what they did as knights. Just think of what it means to participate to a battle. Just think of what it means to kill a person. You're never gonna be the same. And these individuals were taught to be like that. To be inflexible, to withstand that, not to let themselves go. They had to. Another very important thing was the ideal knight has also to be pretty cold-blooded, because especially during collective I mean, during especially information, you can't do whatever you like as if you were a warrior. You have to think straight. You have to obey the orders. You have to obey the horse master and what he tells you. And so it's as if there had been a very tough skin, over these people that was necessarily created for protecting themselves for what they had eventually to venture in. Just think of what it means, I don't know, to be taken away at 7 years old from your mother. Not to see her again, because this is really I don't know, for me this would be definitely a hugely traumatic experience, and this is why from medieval sources we don't have to be surprised to see that these knights were capable of, I don't know, slaughtering people, children, to commit the worst kind of atrocities imaginable, as it was normal for every fighter at that time, to break up in tears when they were read this chivalrous romances about the knight and the dame. And just to think about these men, they were spending most of their lives literally on horseback and fighting and having this kind of even think about the fear. I mean, living in a world where in a few moments you could die, and in any kind of way, because one thing, as I said before, is just being killed into combat, another thing is to get healed for the most stupid reason. The greatest ambition was obviously to get killed into combat, as every kind of warrior wants. But thinking about these angelic-like women of the chivalrous literature, and think, I don't know, about these men were thinking about their mothers, their sisters. In a world where, by the way, women died just so frequently by giving birth, it was pretty normal. So just think of also of these female figures that had been gone, and that they looked upon as kind of spirits, as people who somehow were with them forever in their memory. And so these extreme contrasts between extreme violence, extreme brutality, and from the other side, the, let's say, arguably pretty standard human feelings towards, affection and love and family and so on. So this is a pretty, it would have been extremely interesting to psychoanalyze a medieval knight, because obviously this also varied. Not all the knight. What the kind of knight I'm talking about now is chiefly this one of this full feudal age. Naturally, there were certain knights who were instead very. But say, let's take the average knight, the one that actually made the numbers that we read in the battles, in the sources. Most of the times just about that king or that noble that was in charge of that wing of the army or so on. But what about the other hundreds of knights without a name, without a face, that have been forever lost into history? And that, well, I'm talking exactly about them. It was a terrible life, but it's so very fascinating for us, just like war is so fascinating for us, because probably we all feel a bit like them in a metaphor of life, and how life is tough and it's full of struggle, it's full of uncertainties, it's so short and fragile. So the knight in this sense had to embody the symbol of perfection. It was an example that had to be followed, especially in secular ways. The repetition, the oratores, that is the prayers, the bellatores, that were the warriors, and the laboratores, that were the workers. Well, the knight in this sense was arguably the elite of society, of secular society, and it was what it had to set, ideally, the models for that society. It's not surprising that the knight had to be just. The concept of justice, something that comes straight from in here, both the pagan and Christian roots, and that's why it blended in so much together, because in the Aryan society, the military commander was also someone who had to dispose equally to respect the freedom of this and was let's say placed in that role, not just to be a military commander but also to be a just leader. And in the Gospels you explicitly find referred that who bears the swords doesn't do it in vain. So Christian society in this sense is extremely fascinating, because certain things are going to be interpreted. I mean, Jesus is coming with the sword in this world to tear apart the world. Just think of what this could make a 11th century knight feel. While not reading, because usually they couldn't read, but let's say that when they heard such words, they felt inflamed with these. They were drunk in these ideals, and it's because it was a divine sparkle was present in the knight. Because in the Aryan world, military glory is something that can derive only from the divinity. So who wins into battle doesn't win because of his ability, wins because of his of the gods having rewarded him, naturally also for his abilities, which were in this sense conceived not just in a military fashion but also in a broader sense as just men. And this is the same thing as expressed by the Christian chivalry. The idea that the knight had to swear to make this oath to defend the Christian society, and therefore to be a perfect example of Christian. And naturally this was very ideal, as we've said, but what remained was this divine spark into these men that made them looked upon with extreme admiration. And think of all the stories about chivalry. So these knights fighting against the terrible monsters and killing the weak. Think about Percival. Percival is also another beautiful example of the syncresis between the pagan and Christian tradition. As Percival, he was raised in the forest, because his mother, also in here that women always recur into the chivalric culture, Percival was I think the youngest of 3 male sons, two of which the first 2 of which had died into war. So basically Percival's mother had kept him in the forest to avoid him, essentially, and obviously unsuccessfully trying to preserve him from his own destiny. And so here also the word of the forest is not just a anecdotal detail. It's really a great meaning of what, also in medieval mindset, what this really came from. The idea that the forest is this magical place where you could it's obscure and bright at the same time. It's really dual. It's something that also in here dates back to the Aryan world. In the Aryan world, there is this constant dichotomy between the celestial world and the earthly world. The purity of the skies and the kind of profanity of the heart. So the forest is also a place that naturally has more darker exceptions, but at the same time was a world that was full of mystery and of proofs, of challenges. Even consider the initiatic rituals that were attached to since pagan times to the idea of manhood, and therefore of manhood corresponded to, in fact, you had to be a warrior practically, because all freemen were warriors. And it was kept well into the knight's dubbing ceremony. The dubbing ceremony, even the alleged slap on the face, that didn't really happen all the time, at all times, but it was, however, seemingly this relic of the ancient, actually much tougher physical proofs that existed into the pagan world to access manhood and warriorhood, let's say. And that are present, by the way, not just in the Indo-European world, but also basically in every single tribal society around the world. And the idea was that you had to struggle to emerge. So there was no easy way out, let's say. And that's this selection that have actually provided the true elected knight, because these passing through these proofs equated to pass through the challenges that were set by the divinity, whichever it was. Doesn't matter whether you were pagan or Christian. So knights were not figures like all the others, and especially if you think about the world of the forest, it's usually a dark world, world. While I think Percival tradition is very interesting in this, because he's often depicted as wearing colors like white, light blue, silver, gold. So these are all the colors of the sky, and that's where it came from. It was the idea that the knight had to represent the heavenly rule on earth, and shining. So this idea of the shiny armor is not something just invented, in the 19th century Romanticism, and mostly attached to how polished were the armors. But they definitely were polished and by the way, extremely colorful. Also in medieval times, this is actually true, but you really have to understand the symbolism beyond these colors. Like white and blue are colors that you find also in other peoples of the steppes, that to really think about these elective status of heavens, and silver and gold. Colors were extremely important in this time. You have to think that the knights' armors were all colored. They weren't gray or some were also black, because they were I don't know, you say that they were in order not to make the iron oxidate. But most of them were colored. Of all the most colorful things you can, this was a relic also partly of totemic things, like heraldry is partly something like that. So we have to imagine these knights to be all in red, yellow, green, azure, gold as well. So these were beautiful, and probably I don't know what I would have given just to see an army of knights, like especially during the 13th and first half of the 14th century. It must have been really extraordinary. So the celestial symbolism of the knight has to always borne in mind. The knight was the lord of the light. He was the avenger. He was the armed arm of the divinity. The knight was the person who took literally justice into his own hands through the sword. So the knight is, in this sense, in its celestial symbolism, also a solar figure. It belongs to the lights. It belongs to the day. It's something that has to do with the most pure and divine images that humans could think of. And although this symbolism could not really exist without the dichotomy light and darkness. And there is especially one element that recalls darkness, that is the horse, that is not just about darkness at all. So from one side the horse is, and this is perfectly present in the Indo-European mythology, that the horse is both a celestial and chthonic animal, because at the same time he's the animal that carries the knight into heavens. When you see those burials into the steppes of the Sarmatians, you realize also the Germans did that during the migration era, being buried with your own horse, because ideally the horse had to take the victorious knight into the afterlife, into the heavens, where he belonged, for having been glorious in life. So the horse was slain and buried next to the knight. So just think about the arcane bond that existed, between these two companions. But at the same time, the horse is a chthonic figure. So he's very hurtly. It's a very hurtly being. His sanguineous. It's made of the hurt. It's made of the blood, of dirt. It's very physical. The horse is an extraordinary animal. It inspires this sense of nobility, of might, of pride. And at the same time, the horse can be very obedient. There is also this dichotomy that you find in all the peoples of the steppes, and it was very important, however, also in medieval Europe, the idea of choosing the right horse, because it was the horse that was docile, obedient, that answered just to a simple gesture, just a very subtle voice signal of the knight, and this was crucial to rely on the horse, because the horse had to be perfectly trained, perfectly responsive, and all one with his knight. But at the same time, the horse could be also extremely wild and violent. And you have to think horses, especially war horses, are also extremely violent against humans and other horses, because they're trained to bite, they're trained to punch, they're trained to if you had to kick, obviously, and if you had come close to a medieval knight as an enemy, the horse would have seriously aggressed you. So these were beasts that were kind of combining the two extremes of, in short, the horse was coming from the underworld. Is a deity that comes. If you look, I don't know, in Hellenic mythology, the Pegasus is a typically chthonic animal. It comes from the sea. It was the animal sacred to Poseidon, because Poseidon was associated with the underworld. not just with Hades. It was about the mostly the afterlife and the um, um, and the but Poseidon was the even about the sea and the earth as in this process of natural cycle of death and rebirth. So the sea that gives life. So the idea that life comes from blood, the life comes from the death, and there is regeneration. It was very very important because it was deeply felt in that world. The idea of decomposition, the idea of those sanguineous qualities that were somehow reabsorbed and re-put into circulation through the natural cycle of nature, to the cyclical to the cycle of nature, say better, and therefore it was a combination between the spiritual and the earthly. And this is why you find this very strong and sometimes jarring dichotomy into, for instance, into chivalrous literature between good and evil, all this inner torment, also this problem of even of earthly love. Think about all, in the Arthurian cycle, the problem of knights being in love with the wives of their own lords, but not being, so also this kind of platonic love that instead we know, courtly society, feudal society being also in here very, sometimes also very promiscuous by certain standards. So always this dichotomy, always this differentiation between the ideal and the reality, and especially also into military history. This is very very important because sometimes we get these beautiful pieces of work from chivalrous literature. Think about Wolfram von Eschenbach or Chrétien de Troyes. All these fantastic works that are essentially giving us a quite idealized view of chivalry and of the chivalric code and ethic, and also the way of fighting. The ideal of the feudal world was that the battles had to be resolved by a series of individual fights into which every single the two knights would challenge each other to duel, and at the end of this, obviously they wouldn't kill each other because they were gentlemen, and one would just say, okay, I surrender to you and this person, and put in his hands in the hand of the capture of the winner, and to be ransomed. This is pure idealism. If you and the point is that sometimes we get this as a source because it's a literary source. It was read. It was, and definitely read also by the same knights, because these were works that were conceived for being read into the aristocratic circle, to be better listened and sung into the aristocratic circles. But the reality of warfare was completely different. I mean, loyalty was something extremely rare, let's say. Contrarily was to what people believe, knights made extensive use of crossbows. Yes, you don't find that represented very much, but we know it happened. They did ambushes, and this was so they fought in completely different ways from the ideal. And sometimes what we get is saying, oh well, okay, yeah, this was happening, but it was kind of also depreciated. It was condemned as immoral, as disloyal, as something unworthy for a. Yeah, but at the same time we have a great difficulty because we don't really know what the individual knights mindset about it really was. And I suspect that most of these knights weren't really. I mean, they surely felt very much this idea of pride, of prowess, etc. But um, the idea of the sneaky behavior, of the trick, of the treachery, was kind of always out there. It was used in contrast to the, also in here, to the ideal, because it was also into, if you look, I don't know, think about all the heroes of the Germanic sagas, how they die. You usually get killed by treason. So in this kind of infamous way of dying that, however, is always present. And why? Because it obviously was depicting the reality for what it really was, and therefore, yeah, it was condemned, ideally speaking, but it was just also usual practice in many ways. The idea of the horse, the symbolism of the horse naturally also implies, therefore, the very deep connection between the knight and the world of the night, the world of the afterlife, and of which the horse is a medium, because the idea is the horse will somehow lift you to heavens as well as it bring you down to hell. If you also in here, if you look at the Hellenic tradition, the myth, Plato's myth of the chariot, is exactly the same thing. It was all there, was already there, was conceivably something that comes from straight from also in there the word of the steppe. You know, the white horse that is so good and virtuous and docile and obedient, it brings you to heaven. The black horse, the sanguineous horse, that is so wild and unruly and brings you down. So it was a great metaphor of also of existence of same humans, not just of horses. So the very deep connection between the night and afterlife is something you can trace back to. Think about Woden. In the German tradition, he said, well, the deity of war, Woden is not a warrior as such. He is essentially all the Wodanic tradition is about the connection with afterlife, that gives you a fury that is not probably a completely wild fury. It's something divinely inspired that the knight has, the warrior had, and that made him elected also in there by the divinity, by the deity, by the magic. And in there also you see there was a lot of symbolism, animal symbolism of animals were a connection between, especially these necrophagous animals that were especially to be seen on battlefields after combat to start eating the corpses, and that were felt in this sense to be the personification of Odin. Think about the crow, because that brought physically and literally the corpse away, the soul of the warrior into the afterlife. So also very dark things, but the idea also in here is that the knight had to emerge from this world of darkness in order to shine. It was an initiatic proof. So there can't be heaven if there is not hell, and what a better hell than war on this world that is so material, so physical, it's so while the heavens are the complete overcoming of that miserable physical dimension, of material dimension, of mortal dimension. So the triumph cannot pass but through that, ultimately. And that was what the knight has to do, and especially consider that the knights at this time were, as like in most of the other times, in his actually practically all times, where they had an extremely high level of professionalism and individual training. So even before the full development of feudal cavalry and its organization and its tactics that get refined, especially through the 12th and 13th century, that collective level and all. So where also paradoxically those kind of unloyal tactics were kind to become kind of standard, or at least extremely well known, performed with great ability, so that they were definitely common. The knight was had a relatively poor collective training. Compared to later times, but individually speaking, it was, these were men also were raised in certain environments that were not even fully civilized. You have to think it like that. There were some great parts of Europe were coming out of the world of the forest just into this very moment still. So even think of all the physical resilience, the how these men were used also to endure pain, sufferance. Not because they were special or anything, because their life was kind of about that. Think about knowing the territory, knowing how to survive in the wild. All these errant knights that existed out there were also used to live like, in part, like outcasts, especially when they were, condemned as criminals and for their misconduct, etc. So these were, by the way, people who didn't at all have a this emerges clearly from medieval sources, that they didn't have a clear, if not any, division in their mind from life in war and life in peace. There was no differentiation between military life and civilian life. They were like that. They were molded like that as warriors, and would remain like that for all their lives, arguably. Then, naturally, this evolves. This is the great evolution from the migration era warrior to the late medieval lords. That still retained actually much in common at that point, but with the warrior of the migration era. But it was, however, much more civilized, much more framed into also social hierarchy, a social role, and that's when also chivalry kind of was already declining, as especially the thresholds of the modern age. So naturally it's easy to talk about especially chivalrous tales, the chivalrous literature that is so it's been extensively studied. However, I think much has still to be said because we have seen how literature is ideal in many ways, and much still has to be said on the real life of these knights. Because much has already been told to us, and we know from that there is a universe behind this. So as we were saying before, it's difficult to do because most of the times we don't have the sources. We don't have sources, especially for certain times in the Middle Ages. There is no way to hear the voice of these people, and we most likely will never know. Sometimes we do, but it's not enough to get the whole picture right. And but probably an interdisciplinary approach to chivalry is definitely what, as for other fields, can really bring the major results in the future, and can add up to what we already know. And especially we have to this is something we can already do quite easily, is to understand the social reasons for which such mythical figures like knights basically rose as such into that world. Because you have to understand the knight had a social cost. In order to one day I will make a video on the cost the social cost for a medieval knight. The medieval knight, even as a single fighter, is the tip of an iceberg that is huge. Think of how much it costed just to equip the guy. And for not talking in fact about how for training him for a lifetime, and to steer his sense of also his ideological mindset. These are all resources that had to be drawn, and you can argue that in feudal Europe, the world society basically revolved around these figures in order to make them exist in practice, and to do, because they were functional to society also in this sense. So I stress naturally the kind of meta temporal nature of knighthood, or the atemporal nature of knighthood, even though from a strictly historical point of view this can't obviously be done. Because every time you want to study knighthood, you have to study about what existed in fact at that time, and how knighthood really was. Probably the greatest problem, however, we have, as I was hinting at the beginning, is the idea of how we look at the Middle Ages. This kind of revival that started chiefly from the 19th century, especially in certain areas of Europe, but overall in the whole Western world. And it is so difficult to look at the Middle Ages without passing through these influences. Arguably, the Middle Ages are the most difficult time in history to understand for us now. So we really need to be aware of this, that you can't really approach the Middle Ages if you're not aware of these representations, with all their limits, but at the same time with all their accuracy where there is, in the sense that obviously even Romanticism was kind of idealizing the Middle Ages for some reasons, but was still drawing from the basis of that. I mean, if you one thing is reasoning in purely artistical terms, another thing is observing that in the 19th century finally there was a huge effort to look more in depth into the Middle Ages, to really understand what they were about and how they worked, and think about all the great researches that have been done, especially in Germany, and how the Middle Ages in this sense has been returned, restored in part in what it actually really was. At the same time, there is and this naturally has to do with your cultural preparation as well, because it's not easy to understand what is historical and non-historical, as long as you don't get into it thoroughly, and sometimes it's also very difficult to do this very thing, as the sources are difficult to read and to interpret and to analyze sometimes. So you necessarily need a preparation of some kind that you can't really hope to get in a short while. Approaching the Middle Ages is difficult and will always remain difficult. It's as I was saying before, it's arguably the most difficult period for us to, at this point in history, to figure out correctly, accurately from an historical point of view. So I realize many people today get passionate about the Middle Ages through the media, through this kind of even a fictional side of history, but the risk is, as long as you don't educate yourself about the Middle Ages, is that nothing is going to happen but simply changing type of prejudice, because this is what I've been seeing. When I was a kid, I thought about the Middle Ages. I had a completely different view than I think what in popular culture this really was, than what it is today. And there are many different influences, and this is really normal. It's obvious that every time in history has its own different approach to the same history. But even though there is probably a more widespread interest or towards the Middle Ages, I realized that most of the times it still remains pretty sectary. It still remains pretty fanboy based. It remains also probably devoid of any concrete historical interest, as it's mostly an ideological matter at that point. You see in the way it's also the same Middle Ages are actually split into. There are people who like the Middle Ages just because they imagine them in this extremely narrow perception of certain times and spaces, and they don't care about anything else. And for instance, the Middle Ages is not a period in history you can understand if you don't look around. That's indirectly sometimes the reason why these myths about the same backwardness of the Middle Ages exist. Because people think, oh well, yeah, it was this confined area that everybody lived in his own village, kind of its own identity. No, this is kind of pretty stupid. And I think on Schwerpunkt I extensively talked at this point just yesterday about, for instance, I uploaded a video on the Western translations from Greek and Arabic. Well, you realize that Middle Ages were a highly dynamic and globalized world. There were the Middle Ages have this extremely great ability of synthesis, of syncresis as well, and of original adaptation. So it's true that certain traditions were born at that point, but it is true that those were born at that point, so that before they didn't exist, or at least there were different traditions, were different identities, it's difficult to look at the Middle Ages as a moment, as many people pretend to do, ideologically speaking, for the sake of stressing the kind of the purity of their own heritage, or the this identitary, self-ostentatory, identitary attitudes that, according to me, reveal only that those people don't have anything but that they can recur to understand their own identity. I couldn't understand my own identity if I didn't read of all these things, and I still think I don't quite get it, but surely I get much more of that than people who just want to stress the fact that it's as if they were the same people that existed 1,000 years ago, because this is kind of crazy, and this goes especially with a lot of idealization, a lot of complete misunderstanding of the same medieval sources. It is really impossible to approach history seriously from that point of view. How it is impossible seriously to approach history from fiction. I mean, there is no doubt that fiction can be more or less historically accurate, But most people accept such approximation by saying, well, it's basically like it was. No, it is not even basically like it was, because fiction is not reality by definition, and you can't base yourself on fiction to pretend to know reality. Because fiction is done, especially in the way it's done, most 99% of the time, just to impress you, just to entertain you. There is a certain fiction that is beautiful indeed, but it's extremely rare. Most of these are very rare works of art, of pieces of also of movies. If you're interested in cinema, so you can find something like that, but it's more of the artistical value that you have to take into account rather than the historical accuracy, because you'll never see how history was from a movie. The only way you can, or at least the only way you can try to get the closest to, is objectively studying history, and there is no other way, because that's the only way we get those informations from. And I realize most people can't do that. It's kind of obvious, but I think it's the duty of the people who study history to make people understand what history is in the first place, because there is a lot of misconception about what history is, as well as in parallel with the wild approximation, with the wild misunderstandings of even the essentials of, in this case, medieval history. That could be, in this sense, easily fixed, so that schools, for instance, do not at all a good job at telling this, at least as I've seen. I guess the result is pretty evident out there. It's because it's difficult to teach. First of all, teaching is has a lot to do with communication, and it's something that really implies a lot of intelligence to do. It's not something that it's not just reading something is enough to go out there to tell it to people. You have first of all to have understood what you've read yourself, and secondly, you know how to communicate it to others. I'm trying to do this on Schwerpunkt. I don't know how much I don't think I'm such a great I try to make disclosure more than else. I probably am not by nature a great communicator, but nevertheless, I always try to make people challenge their own security, their own alleged certainties, because you can't be a historian if you're certain about things. It's impossible. Being a historian teaches you not to be certain about anything, because that's the only way that can push you to find something else. And that's how it's always been into history as well. Progress never came from people who stayed there idling, all satisfied about everything. Progress came through struggle and sufferance and desperate needs and all. So there can be no improvement if there is no fertile ground in this sense, and I mean it at every level, because things do not have to progress necessarily by themselves. We could also go down at a certain point. There is a crucial moment in medieval history. I'm going back a bit on the subjective at a subjective level. If at the very beginning of this video, I was criticizing the. If you Google, especially in English, something like medieval knight, most of the times you'll get a full plate armor, a guy in full plate armor of the 15th century. So it seems the British world, for instance, has interiorized this view of the Middle Ages. Indeed, English historiography and then all the countries and the Anglosphere, let's say, that have been influenced by that, gave a big deal of surely of attention to put a lot of emphasis to naturally the 100 Years' War, the War of the Roses. So times that in that sense naturally have a very important meaning into England. In the English Middle Ages, they're also starting to be relatively well documented, and they are widely important for many reasons that I will hope to discuss one day. But in this sense, British historiography has kind of given us a certain picture of what the Middle Ages are stereotypically are. You know, if you Google always in English about, I don't know, you Google medieval village, most of the times, without any further specification, you get the picture of what is typically a northern European medieval village. Rarely a southern one or a eastern one. So this contributes to really form a so-called imaginary. Think about this timber-framed so-called Tudor style. You know, it's something that first of all it happens in the very late Middle Ages. So it's interesting how even the media, the fiction has kind of it kind of pushed in the Anglosphere towards that direction. In other countries, it's not really like that. There are different views. There are different times. And for me, if I had to tell, what's really the moment of that is kind of the most important for you, for what's the knight you think of in your mind when you think stereotypically about a knight? What is that comes into your mind? Well, to me, the figure of a knight is mostly a 10, let's say from the 10th to the 13th century, stereotypically speaking. I know it doesn't make sense because there were knights before and after. I'm personally very keen on especially the first half of the 14th century European warfare. But I'm extremely fascinated, especially from this central part of the Middle Ages. You can argue periodize that like the High Middle Ages, and because I think that this was a bit the acme of the feudal knight as such, of the miles as such. It would be pretty complicated to explain eventually, and this is not what I want to do today, why this is the case. But I mean, to anyone who has a kind of a basic knowledge of medieval history knows, kind of can guess at least the reasons for this choice. You can argue this was, why periodizing this? You can say, well, because this was the age of the of chivalry and for instance, of cavalry proper. But even if you look at these central centuries of the Middle Ages, the supremacy of mounted combat on the foot one is not really so immediate. It's something you can start seeing happening towards it's something first of all very progressive, very slow. You can argue that only towards the end of the 10th century you can start saying, okay, finally cavalry has certain edge in certain areas, in certain spaces over the infantry. Then there is a because you can say, well, also in Carolingian times, so also in the 9th century, it was easy, yes and no. It also here it's very difficult to explain. Surely I will dedicate a video to all of these topics altogether. But most importantly, in fact, in this process, to understand is that cavalry feudal cavalry had all a prehistory. That is what I like to stress so much. That goes beyond the sheer tactical supremacy of cavalry on the battlefields. And these are all changes. This is a process that entails a very complex development of social and economical situations that were surely also they were structural, but they were in this going also in parallel with different ways of feeding and thinking a knighthood, and all its value, the attached values. And as it happens in, historically speaking, it might as well happen that knighthood and chivalry as we know them might have not happened during the Middle Ages. I mean, think about all the various vicissitudes of the Carolingian dynasty. I mean, there could have easily been no Charlemagne. There could have easily been no unity of the Carolingian Empire to accomplish the conquests it did from the second half of the 8th century. And so what is the I mean this was a fluid system. This is what I'm trying to say. It could also evolve into a different way, and if you study military history you perfectly understand this. There is a kind of different phase of a swinging and oscillation, I don't know how to say this, kind of sinusoidal, also here approximately, evolution of the relation between cavalry and infantry. Arguably the moment of greater contraction was in the mid of the 16th century. Then eventually cavalry starts to kind of regain ground, and as even during the same Middle Ages, definitely the 13th century is really the peak of mounted combat in Europe. Or in the 14th, we have infantry armies of commoners that start to, for instance, to meet the cavalrymen in open field, and without the help of other cavalry, and to win over them. This is very important because, by the way, you never have to think that cavalry was out there alone. Even in the moments of greatest strength of the greatest efficacy of mounted combat in the 13th century, there were always, even if the always infantry troops supporting cavalry, and even if the sources sometimes stated that they weren't, and sometimes certain armies at that period were also kind of virtually all mounted, at least in certain contexts, but infantry never disappears really from Western warfare, not even during this moment of greatest development of feudal cavalry. So we don't have to reason in deterministic ways, however, and looking at these transformations helps you understand really what the point is about this. However, so for now, I introduced this other terrific topic of a bit of military history, but I will touch it. About the evolution of armies in terms of cavalry, infantry ratio, etc. But I will discuss it some other time. So for now, I stop in here, and I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.